Well, the request that came in for this quick tip is short and sweet. Person says simply, I'd like to see a quick tip on creating movement in paintings. Well, let's move on that. When we're speaking of movement in paintings, we're talking about visual movement. We're not really talking about actual movement on the painting surface. We're talking about what we're doing on the painting surface to make our eyes move. Our eyes react to changes. And we look at the picture like this, you would think, well, I don't see anything there. Well, you see some movement there. You see movement from one color into another. And you see movement from one shape to another. But it's a very quiet movement, a very subtle movement, and you would think, I don't see anything. Well, you don't see anything, but you do see color, and you do see value, and you do see shape. So if I'm going to just take a portion of that now. I have some other photos that bring that into focus, and I want to explain movement, visual movement, by using this process of when something is totally out of focus, we see a very subtle movement. So that tells us that when we're doing painting and we want an area to be quiet, throwing it out of focus is one way to get it quiet. So what I want to do here is I'm just going to take a section of this, and I'm just going to show you how we can cause the movement to come forward or create the movement, and what we do to create that movement. So I'm just going to start. I think I'll just go ahead and just start by throwing some out of focus areas on the canvas that were very similar to the out of focus areas that we're seeing there. Won't be quite, absolutely the same, but we could say very similar to what we're seeing there. And you can see all I'm doing there is I'm looking at the colors we're seeing there, and I'm simply throwing those colors in out of focus in the value that I'm seeing them, and I'll blend those. Throwing things out of focus simply means putting the color down and blending it. So we'll just sort of blend some of those colors together, and I'm not going to extend the tip into a big time frame to make it a complete painting. We just don't do that with these quick tips. We're just trying to show how to think something through and how to know what to do when you're thinking it through. All right, so what we're seeing there, but just a little bit of that blue in there, and what we're seeing happen there, we're seeing that going a little bit, let's see, no, that's not blue enough. Let's get that a little bit, leaning a little bit more towards a blue, and that's not light enough. So let's get the values pretty much as we see them there. And well, okay, this is I overshot value-wise there. There we go. That's getting a little bit closer. Oh, that's a little bit different blue than we're seeing there, but that's okay for the demonstration. So I'm just going to keep it there for the demonstration, the purpose of the demonstration, and say, all right, so now we have colors out of focus. We can tell the difference in the shape, so we have some movement, but not very much. In other words, there's a change between this and this that causes the eye to move back and forth between the two. Now, if we wanted to add a stronger visual movement, what we can do is to look at something that is more in focus. So I'm just going to take this one away. As you can see, this is a more focused version of what we see right here. And you can see when you compare those two, this is a lot more active. Now what makes it active is a part of the answer to the question. What creates visual movement? what makes this active here is we see lots of little value contrast. We see a little more specific edges, sharper edges, but more value contrast. The eye is more entertained by all this texture that's caused by the value contrast than it is by this. And so and it's not a matter of which one you like better. That's not even consideration. It's a matter of what is happening visually here to cause activity. Activity creates movement, and activity is caused by value contrast and color contrast. And one more element, which I'll point out in just a minute. And so then I will do just a little bit of something in here now to begin to create a little bit more texture in these areas. So what we'll do there is I'll begin to, in this area here, just add a little bit of texture. So, and that is simply varying the value. We have a tiny little areas of differing values. And we can go into the other, let's get this just a little bit, there we go. Go into this, and those values could be lighter, like this. Get this right here. Make it lighter. Those little value areas could be lighter. But you can see the edges there get more specific. That begins to create more visual movement. When we get those areas more specific, like that. And I'm just observing the light that I'm seeing there when I'm doing that. And so we can do that. And then in this area over here, what we see more visual movement in the sky area, because what's actually happening there is we're seeing more specific edges. So I'll go here and let's see, be sure we have the right value. Yeah. And then we begin to do this and create more specific edges. And you can see now that value contrast is causing this kind of movement. If I put another little group of that stuff here, connect it and bring it on down and get it connected in this area here, now you see that begins to guide our eye. The value contrast and the color contrast, the texture contrast, that's beginning to create a stronger movement. And so now we can go to the next version. And we'll take this one away. So I can get it away without taking everything else down. And now we see we've got something else happening. We're having now a different kind of activity. We would call this a movement that's really going in many directions. So with this going in many directions, now we have another kind of direction established. Now I have named for you visual elements that cause movement. Value, contrast, visual elements and what they do. Contrast of value causes movement. The stronger the value contrast, as you can see right here, will cause movement. The eye will move when there's value contrast. Our eye will move from tree trunk to tree trunk to tree trunk because those tree trunks are so much darker than the areas around it, in spite of the fact that we have other kinds of movement around them. And so then we begin to establish an overall pattern of movement within the piece itself. And so in this case, what we could do is begin to throw in some very dark value contrast. So we can see that this is very, very dark. So I'll go in here with my very dark mixtures, get that that color and that value, very, very dark, warm color. And I can just sort of observe now. I've done this more in this area right over in here. So I'm going to do is kind of fudge it just a little bit. And let's say, okay, we've got a tree trunk that's coming up here like that. And now you can see I've begun to create some visual movement. Now you can see now your eye will do this. Instead of your eye exploring this area here, or instead of your eye moving along with these little differences here, now your eye is doing something else. That value contrast and the movement in that direction of that value contrast is causing your eye to move in that direction. And then if I repeat that, repetition of the same kind of direction will establish a pattern of movement. That's movement. It could be circular, or it could be diagonal, or it could be vertical, it could be horizontal, but every image has got built into it a set of visual movements that give it its shape and its characteristic, or we might say its shape and its characteristic create its movement. But then we start putting those together in a painting, we start creating that movement. And the way we do that is with value contrast, with color, and with direction. The direction we make those things move. So then if I plotted a few more of these trunks, little tiny trunks as they're going up, now you see I've got a repeated movement. That direction of visual movement vertical is even stronger. And now put another one going up, or maybe a set of them going up. You see, the more I put in there, the stronger that pattern of vertical movement. Let's put just a little bit more right over here and here. And you can see, that now begins to feel a little bit like the same kind of movement we're seeing in this scene. All right, let's go to one more interpretation. Of course, this was the original. In this one, I simply pulled out some of the more horizontal stuff. In that one, we begin to get more a counter movement. Can you see that? How we've got all these repeats of vertical, but now we're also beginning to get a variation in size that influences that. So the stronger or the larger the size of something that's the same value, the stronger the movement. So this is a stronger vertical movement right here. And so you can see if I do this, if I change this one now to a much larger shape of dark contrast. I mean, if you just call them these trees, it doesn't really tell you anything, but it's value contrast. So if I change that, you see how now that's getting more attention. It's got a stronger movement. But then if I add those limbs, I get a counter movement, which can make it much more interesting when we're doing painting. So let's see, if I just sort of pick up on this limb right here, and let's see, it's sort of coming down a little bit like that. Just sort of move it out a little bit like that. Then now you see I've created a counter movement. So this is the value contrast here is pulling the eye in this direction more strongly because we have a repeat of the same kind of movement, and we have a bit larger shape that's taking on that vertical movement. And now as this limb moves across like that, it creates a counter movement. In other words, a movement going in the opposite direction. So we balance those, we try to balance those out when we're doing a painting. If we're doing a painting of this scene, we would want the dominant feeling of vertical, because it's about tree trunks, and there's that uplift. So those darker value contrast as moving in a vertical direction, and then they're stabilized by these limbs that are moving in some of them moving more horizontal, some of them moving more diagonal. So the different kind of movement in the limbs themselves is going to create a different kind of movement. And my brush is too thick there to really show those thin, but that gives you the idea. So you see, you're simply using visual elements. That's all when we're painting, that's what we're doing. That's our language. That's what we are manipulating. So the visual element that causes the three visual elements that cause movement are the value contrast, the color contrast, and the direction of shape, of texture, mainly of shape and of texture, but all those things working together with color, the variations of color. Oh, one more thing I want to show you here that we can do to cause the visual movement is that we can vary color. And what I'll just do there is take a very bright very saturated hue of, say, this color, and if I throw that in there, you see how that will get your attention? That then begins to give that an additional visual movement. And if I add a little bit more of that down here, you see, and if I make it lighter, go into a lighter, a more yellow, you see there, that then makes that richer, gives that more visual movement. And now I can counter a movement with color, have the color to begin to take on its own movement like that against that vertical movement, which makes it even richer. So you see, it's mainly just establishing directions and with the visual elements, and then the strength of that is done with the degree of contrast. The weaker the contrast, the quieter the movement. So if you go back to the original photo that we had of the, here it is, the original photo we have of the very, very blended color, very blended value, very close value relationship. You can see how this comes from this, but even though there is subtle movement here, there's the movement gets stronger the more contrast we add to it, the more textural contrast, the more value contrast, and then establishing the direction of those movements. So you see, it all comes down to the visual elements. And I think everything does. But I think if you practice that with different kinds of subjects, you can find different kinds of movements, visual movements in all subjects. And that's one thing that really gives paintings their dynamics. Be sure to view all of our quick tips. And while you're doing so, subscribe to the channel, click on the bell so you'll always get a notice when we produce a new quick tip, which is every week. And if you have a question, leave it in the comments section and we'll make a quick tip for you. Also, take a trip over to DianneMize.com where I have full-length lessons, downloads, DVDs, lots of other stuff there, some free stuff for you. And while you're there, you can subscribe to the newsletter, and that way you'll always be informed every time we do something new.